I think health and safety has a massive brand issue.
Yep.
And it's such a shame. It's the thing that makes me most disappointed, actually, about sort of the thing I'm in.
Define that brand issue.
The brand issue is that it's a impediment to business success,
Yep.
and it's a must do and have to do because it's imposed on me. But it isn't what we talked about 20 minutes ago, which is, could it actually, if it was properly conveyed, make people see that it's a value creator,
Yes.
or at the very least, a protector of value for
Yes.
an organisation?
Trying to find, as you say, the unicorn is pretty challenging. So, and it's not an uncommon occurrence in our line of work. You know, we speak to organisations who say we want X, Y, and Z. So that's great. They don't exist.
Yeah.
So the big challenge, and Brian says about trying to attract people from certain backgrounds, is we can potentially identify them, but do they want to move as well? So there is undoubtedly a skill shortage.
I think if I reflect on my own career, there was a seminal moment in terms of my development.
Yeah.
And the moment was when I actually was put into a P&L role. I had 15 months of actually running a business or running a part of a business with all of the things that, are associated with that.
Yeah.
And then when I came out of that and was given an opportunity to take on a pretty significant health and safety role, my level of understanding but also empathy for the operational leadership and the challenges associated with that grew exponentially and unquestionably made me a better health and safety leader.
Welcome to another episode of the Art of Safety Leadership podcast series. Today we've got an awesome episode lined up for you, looking at what does the health and safety professional look like in 2040? Where are we at today? What are the gaps? And what are the things we need to be thinking about developing towards that 2040 target? Now today we've got two awesome guests on the couch. We've got Liam Tiddy, Head of Executive Search for Shirley Parsons, and we've got Brian Long, Group Safety Director, Health and Safety Director for Wates Group. Do you guys want to give us a bit of an introduction about what you do, your safety journey, and let the listeners know a little bit about yourself?
Brian Long, delighted to be here. I've been in this game roughly for about 25 years.
Yep.
I've been very fortunate. I've worked offshore in the UK, different places around the world. And I hope I can sort of give some pearls of wisdom and some learnings and some insights based on that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And Liam, a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I work for Shirley Parsons. We're a global recruitment company and consultancy specialising in HSEQ support, working across sectors. I've been working for the company for 20 years, evolved my career into executive search, so any leadership appointment for health and safety directors, heads of, I tend to lead on.
Yep. I mean, that's a really interesting, I suppose, insight and lens you have on the marketplace. And I think you've been doing that for the best part of 20 years, kind of as you've sort of developed through with Shirley Parsons. What's probably been, just to kind of open things up, what's probably been the biggest thing you've seen change, before we look forwards, maybe look backwards a little bit, what's been one of the biggest things you've seen shift over your time? And I'll come to you, Brian, as well after this, in the last, say, 20 years from a safety professional perspective.
Yeah, when I reflect back, looking back to 2005 compared to today, the big shift is in expectations on the safety leader. So I think it's fair to say, compliance is still important, but that was the be-all and end-all for a lot of companies.
Yep.
That's definitely shifted. Today, there's much more expectation on business sense about actually how is health and safety going to help the organisation be ultimately successful. So trying to pair it up rather than being a bolt-on.
Yep. So almost saying like doing that compliance piece well is the expectation, not the target anymore, and now we're sort of moving beyond that. Is it a fair perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. For most companies, not all. Every company is slightly different in their expectations, but there's definitely a drive towards actually how do you not just protect the people and the company, but how do you actually help the company drive towards success, not for today, but for the next 5-10 years.
Yep. Yeah. Brian, your perspective, I mean, you've got a wonderful global view of things through your career over the last 25 years. What have you sort of seen as the biggest sort of shifts in the profession?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite similar to Liam. If I had to sort of single out one thing, I'd probably say that it kind of feels like the people that are successful are the ones that can make safety feel like a value add for
Yes.
the organization. So
Yep.
it's a value contributor
Yep.
to the overall success of the company. And it goes a little bit to what Liam said. I think the company then has to be able to perceive that, want that, and seek that level of talent. But the ones that seem to break through and ultimately keep people safe, but also actively contribute to the overall success of a company,
Yep.
are the ones that can convey that value, and safety being a value and a value contributor.
Do you think that ties into that kind of comment you made, Liam, around, that whole shift around compliance maybe would be more of the target going back in time for the safety professional, but now it's sort of an expectation that that's managed, but actually there's this sort of above the line value now about unlocking business performance value on the back of a health and safety uplift. Is that a fair kind of way of kind of framing that, Brian?
I think so. I have some pretty firm views on compliance as a concept or as a domain anyway,
Yeah.
because I think we're in a very interesting kind of part of the evolutionary cycle in that sense.
Yep.
On the face of it, people assume that compliance is just the base and the ticket to the game.
Yep.
But what's happening from a regulatory standpoint, and I guess from a sort of a industrial standpoint, is we're putting more and more emphasis on compliance.
Yes. Yep.
So you've kind of got this juxtaposition for people to say, well, I don't want to be solely tied to compliance or linked to compliance, but the machine that's going on around industry is actually putting more emphasis on compliance. And you look at my industry with the Building Safety Act and the response to Grenfell.
Yes.
The response is correct, and obviously the intent with something like that is to achieve safer outcomes. But the compliance burden has significantly grown as a consequence and in response to that event. So people are wanting to move beyond compliance, but the sort of machinery that's going on around them is making it quite difficult to do that.
Yeah, compliance is getting broader.
It's getting bigger and harder and broader, yes.
All right, so we've had a little, I suppose, an initial look at backwards in the rearview mirror to think about, how things have evolved over the last 20 years at a reasonably high level and kind of where things are at the moment. If you sort of cast your thinking forward, say 20 years from now, 10, 20 years, and you think about some of the macro changes going on out there in the world and how they start to impact on safety leaders, what are the kind of big ticket things you can see in the future state that we should be thinking about now? Liam?
Yeah, so from my perspective, it's a really challenging question to look 20 years forward, even 1 year forward is pretty challenging. There's the obvious topics on AI, aging workforce. I think it's the diversification of risk, the new workforce coming into the market, as well as the older workforce as well. So there's so much to consider, and then expectations from board of directors, from senior leaders, from senior stakeholders is incredibly complex. So we can talk about technology, and that is important, of course, but actually I think it's that how do safety leaders develop their skill set around softer skills, engagement, leadership. When I'm speaking with hiring directors, they very rarely talk about the technical side. That is a given. It's actually how do you engage, how do you lead, how do you make complex situations clear for the workforce. And I mean, those are the challenges that people are going to have to accept and enjoy, and that from that people need to have real energy to be successful.
And how far, when you talk about some of those sort of hiring clients that are looking for talent to come in and lead, how big is the gap, I guess, between what they're articulating in terms of expectation and kind of where a lot of the market is? Like how big is that gap that needs to be transcended?
There's plenty. There is enough good leaders out there to do the jobs who have got, say, talk about business sense, commercial awareness, etc., etc. Where the challenge is the next generation leaders. There's not enough opportunities for people to step up. A lot of companies will say, we want a future leader or someone from a different sector. But when push comes to shove, the safe option is often taken. Now, whether that's right or wrong is not really my decision. But the reality is, for people to get a chance at the top of the table isn't easy.
Yep. Brian, what are you seeing? And what's your view of that sort of 2040 landscape in terms of the profession?
I mean, as Liam said, it's sort of difficult to predict, but I guess if I had to focus on a couple of things, maybe if I quote Matthew Syed's sort of fixed mindset, growth mindset, and that sort of shift or toggle that people need to make, I would say the safety leader traditionally has been a little bit fixed in terms of mindset. Very much anchored to sort of a principle or even sort of a moral stance around this sort of stuff. If you look at the complexities of doing business today and ultimately the trade-offs that companies are trying to make between profitability, sustainability and safety, then I think it's critical that the safety leader is able to sort of bring an adaptability and an ability to be curious and understand that, yes, they need to have business acumen and commercial acumen, but ultimately that's not enough. I think the sort of breakthrough is, can you deal with those things when they're trading off with health and safety? And how do you navigate that for yourself, for the people you work with, and then the people you work for?
And how do you, I suppose, and how you break that down for a board of directors, an executive team, in a way that's in business language rather than safety sort of technical language, and demonstrate consideration of of those business factors that you talk about. Whereas maybe, and correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but maybe more traditionally, the safety person would sort of put that up, and then they would leave that consideration to that executive team rather than actually offer that consideration proactively.
100%. I think the job is becoming one of enabling and helping people, firstly, to see those trade-offs and the criticality of those, and then aiding and assisting people to make the right decision. So it's not the safety person making that decision, but the safety person is contributing enough inside information and coaching such that the person sort of in the hot seat can make the right decision and an informed decision.
100%. That's great. Liam, what are you saying in terms of, like, if you're I don't know, you might be say 40, 45-year-old safety professional, you might have your sort of early on in the leadership side of the profession. You might be a safety director in a smaller company, something like that, coming through and hearing that, what that looks like. Like, what are the sort of the developmental kind of pathways here for someone to navigate that, so that they, when they say in 10, 20 years, they're really able to perform and deliver in these areas? Yeah,
so often for an aspiring leader, and you say they're obviously in a leadership role, but obviously got room for growth, it's the chance to put themselves in positions which might not be comfortable. So actually challenge themselves in the exec committees, but also going outside the immediate circle of influence, actually going to the HSE, for example, or other governing bodies, actually trying to understand what's going on in the market, reach out to other people in the sector, build their own networks, and really try and understand what business is doing, what their industry is doing, but also actually be visible, be active. I think there's a danger when someone becomes a leader, they go into the shell a little bit. They have to do the paperwork, have to do the reports, and forget actually a lot of the influence and understanding comes from being on the shop floor. And I think that's often the challenge. A lot of leaders still have to be operational and strategic at the same time, and that is a challenging dynamic to actually to try and to walk along. And I imagine Brian's probably been there in the past as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I reflect on my own career, there was a seminal moment in terms of my development, and the moment was when I actually was put into a P&L role. Because it was real. I had 15 months of actually running a business or running a part of a business with all of the things that are associated with that. And then when I came out of that and was given an opportunity to take on a pretty significant health and safety role, my level of understanding but also empathy for the operational leadership and the challenges associated with that grew exponentially, and unquestionably made me a better health and safety leader. So I think there's something in that around, whether it's forced or you sort of encourage it, but people in our positions, in safety leadership positions, they have to build that appreciation and empathy for what's happening in their operational side of the business.
So it's a really fascinating kind of pathway, right? Because when you sort of sit back and think about the journey of the safety professional, if you like, they go get a qualification, chartership, whatever it might be, enter into a lower, more operational role, I suppose. And then we sort of tend to take an approach of promoting the good ones into leadership, and all of a sudden they're there.
Yeah.
And then that sort of just, eventually in a director role and so forth. And what we're saying here, actually, it doesn't necessarily need to be that linear sort of traditional approach. Actually, it may make really good sense to actually maybe even step out of a specific safety role into a general management role or even a commercial role, something like that, to grow some of those attributes.
Yeah.
And then if the fire's still burning bright and that's where you want to go pathway wise, then bring that back in to that safety leadership role to then bring that much more broader business interdisciplinary kind of experience to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. I think and companies have been doing this for a long time, so it isn't sort of that new. But I guess the slight sort of little warning I would give around it as well is that what a lot of organizations do is they ask operational people to then come and do a safety role for a period.
Yep.
And it can work, but there is a slight danger that the person from the operational division going in and doing safety, there isn't that fire in the belly for safety, or it's a little bit transactional. Or so I think the sweet spot is when somebody has a natural sort of tendency or interest in health and safety. They get the opportunity to do that piece in operations, and then they come back. That to me is the sort of strengthening of that capability versus sort of doing it the other way around.
Yeah, absolutely. Liam, what's your view on that? Having heard that sort of journey and from an executive search perspective, and obviously talking to the hiring clients that are looking to bring talent in, is that the sort of skill set that they are valuing?
Yeah, absolutely. If I see a profile, speak to an individual who has diversity of experience, be it at different sectors, different backgrounds in terms of the jobs they've held, be it engineering, be it other leadership roles, or just actually evolved into health and safety. And there's nothing wrong with being a health and safety professional from a graduate. There's plenty of people who are successful that way. But when we see people having exposure in different areas, it proves a point that they can be successful in pretty much any avenue. Also, as an aside, we talk about safety leadership. Actually, the difference I see with the best health and safety directors, they would be directors or leaders in whatever discipline they've chosen to go in. So you kind of almost take the safety bit away, and actually they're just a very good leader. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating point. And it starts to maybe, I suppose, get people thinking a little bit in terms of their development, where they might access that development, the pathways they might access. I think you did some postgraduate business school stuff, I think, is it?
I did, yes. Yeah, at Wharton and at INSEAD as well.
Yeah, so maybe do you want to just maybe share a little bit about the sorts of opportunities or the sorts of content that those presented to you for people out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably a similar theme in that it gives you that broader appreciation for the different aspects that go into making a successful business. So there was a focus on the commerciality and profit and loss, etc. Lots on communication and communication style, which was fascinating in terms of how you come across, but also the types of communication that you prefer or dislike from people towards you, and all of these things that I would never have had any exposure to if I just followed a very sort of limited, sort of overly technical sort of developmental path. So I guess the theme that I'm trying to convey is by having that diversity, to Liam's point, and be it training or be it experience, invariably you're going to become a much better leader. It's unquestionable. So
there's a great practical take out of that for our listeners around thinking about their personal development and professional development pathway. They can lift and shift their role into another role and experience another role. That's sort of one way of achieving it. Or they could pursue a postgraduate business school type opportunity to get more, I suppose, the academic pathway to expose themselves to that skill set. But at the end of the day, it's about working out how they're able to do that, because the value of their broader business capability is, what I'm hearing from both of you is kind of mission critical for where things are going from a leadership perspective. We've been chatting a little bit about what the future of the sort of safety leadership piece looks like 10, 20 years down the line, and maybe where some of the gaps are, and where the developmental kind of pathways may fit for the leader. If we start to just broaden the conversation a little bit now in terms of the safety team, the modern safety team, the evolution of the safety team to support the function going forward, what are the kind of shifts you're seeing? If I'm a a safety director of tomorrow, group director of safety, that kind of role. What should I be thinking about in terms of my team composition and the shape and skill set that I need to be thinking about to support me in the organisation I'm working with? Liam?
Yeah, so my view, again, is diversity. So I mean, in the past, lots of teams, not just in safety, but across the board, were a group of mini-me's. And I remember for my first management foray, I just tried to get people who were like me, and I targeted them like myself, and realised pretty quickly that didn't work. And it sounds very naive, but that was the reality of the situation. Yep. So it is much more complex for businesses now as well. The changing landscape of risk, as we've spoken about. So what skill sets do you want? You might not want a traditional safety advisor. You might want someone who looks at data, who can analyse data. We've got so much information coming into businesses, but probably haven't got people who can articulate the outcomes of those and what you do with it.
Like the insight from the data.
Absolutely. And then the challenge from my perspective and Shirley Parsons' perspective is, actually, do these people exist in the market? Do none of these opportunities exist? And then it comes back to a previous point, actually, will companies take the perceived risk of taking these people on board or revert to type? And that's probably a challenge Brian has with his teams.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first question that I always ask, or that I think people should ask, is what's the construct of safety in the organisation you're in?
Yep.
And so if I give you my current role and what we are sort of faced with at Wates, we've got a blend of things. So we've got exposure to high hazards. We've got more task-based, sort of traditional health and safety exposures, people hurting themselves or getting injured doing work. And then we've obviously got the emergence of the mental health and the sort of well-being challenges that just have emerged through society more generally. So that's the first thing. You sort of say, well, what does health and safety represent where I operate?
Yep.
And I think too many times people don't spend enough time looking at that component.
Context.
Absolutely. So you kind of need to build a team that would have some element of specialism in those things, as opposed to having generalists. Would be my view. The second thing that I think you absolutely need in a modern day sort of organization is you have to have that data and that data insight capability. Again, it's probably been undercooked in the past, but information is power, and having that information quickly and having the ability for somebody to take information, sort of break it down and then convey it back in a simple way is crucial. So data, and particularly data insight, for me is a critical skill. And you may again have a specialism or a person dedicated to that. And then the other thing that I think, again, it'll depend on the context of an organization, but a lot of us are brought into organizations to either nudge things forward or transform things.
Yep.
So you need somebody with that program management rigor, discipline, sort of programmatic ability to be sort of rigorous and follow through on things and give that credibility to the things you want to deliver. So that would be sort of my sense of the modern day health and safety function and the different parts that would go into making up sort of a function that would be high performing.
It's really interesting insight. And just to pick up the last point you made there around that transformational skill set, I know from a Safe 365 perspective, we work with our customers to measure their safety maturity and identify what the work programs are needed to elevate that maturity to bring down harm and drive business outcomes. And the biggest challenge that they have is how do I implement those dial movers, those dial mover interventions that are going to lift our safety maturity while maintaining our BAU program of work, our number of inspections and audits and investigation delivery and all the things we need to do, our risk assessments and all the things that happen out there day in, day out on the floor. But realising that the dial moves are the things that are going to drive those strategic outcomes. We could dig into that a little bit more in terms of what does that skill set really start to look like, and how do you navigate that as a safety director? How do you navigate that BAU driver versus the dial movers, and making sure that there's enough space and capability to drive the dial movers to sort of lift the whole kind of maturity of the organisation? Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I think that to use the terminology, having a high-performing dial mover and somebody that has capability and
Technical
interest
term.
in somebody that has capability and interest in health and safety,
Yep.
they're a bit of a unicorn.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so what I've
Opportunity.
tended to do in sort of my career is probably look for somebody with maybe Big Four experience or somebody that comes out of a consulting background. They might have a interest in human factors or in more socially sort of, I guess, relevant things. So they'd have that sort of ethical, moral
ESG
underpinning.
consulting kind of thing.
Exactly.
Yep.
And so then when you get them to sort of want to do some stuff around safety, it's less of a reach for them to kind of get their head around that. So personally, my experience would be you kind of have to go into that consulting engine or that consulting machine and see if you can find people who want to sort of, make a name for themselves and drive something fundamental and transformational in an organization, albeit in and around health and safety.
And then presumably giving them the, I suppose, the safety net of kind of not getting burdened with the BAU.
Absolutely, it's a standalone. It's a standalone thing. Yes,
Yeah.
I think you if you try and kind of blend those two things, particularly if the agenda is quite transformational, you will end up failing.
You BAU all day long.
Absolutely, yeah.
Liam, what's your perspective on that?
Trying to find, as you say, a unicorn is pretty challenging. So, and it's not an uncommon occurrence in our line of work. We speak to organisations who say we want X, Y, and Z. So that's great. They don't exist.
Yeah.
So the big challenge, and Brian says about trying to attract people from certain backgrounds, is we can potentially identify them, but do they want to move as well? So there is undoubtedly a skill shortage, and a wider point is actually attracting bright sparks into the industry, and that goes probably down to marketing the opportunities better. I think we did go for a really good patch, probably in the 90s and early 2000s, where certainly in the UK there was good university courses. Some of those are shut down now due to commercial decisions. So, and that pipeline of really good future leaders has kind of come to an end. So, the big challenge is how do we get the next generation of school leavers, university leaders, to see this as actually a genuinely good career option, which it is. It's just incredibly badly marketed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe, and it draws on that point very much around if you're a graduate and you're looking at what you want to do with your career, and you might be kind of aligned to professional services, that sort of industry. You don't naturally sort of think of becoming a safety professional, because that's not necessarily the pathway, the way you're thinking about it, but actually pursuing that kind of more business administration and consulting and skill set, and then putting a safety flavour on it, because that's an industry you're interested in. And maybe the understanding that is a genuine pathway. You don't need to go through the traditional safety professional route to get there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I could get on my high horse about this
Go
sort
for
of
it.
stuff.
Now's your chance.
Yeah, I think health and safety has a massive brand issue.
Yep.
And it's such a shame. It's the thing that makes me most disappointed, actually, about sort of the thing I'm in.
Define that brand issue.
Oh, the brand issue is that it's a impediment to business success, and it's a must do and have to do because it's imposed on me. But it isn't what we talked about 20 minutes ago, which is, could it actually, if it was properly conveyed, make people see that it's a value creator, or at the very least a protector of value for an organization. And I wonder, even using the term safety and some of the terminology, is it so tarnished that it's going to really struggle to kind of burst beyond that or move beyond that, which is why I like terminology like resilience, resilience engineering, reliability, stuff like that, because it's firstly, it's not tarnished by that clipboard tick box
kind of
mentality, and it kind of is a little bit sexier for people. I think when they think about resilience, they associate it with different things. So I would say that we, the profession, we have a massive kind of question to ask ourselves, which is, well, is the reason why people aren't coming into the profession the fact that we actually do a terrible job at conveying what the profession is and what it should be and what it could be for organisations?
Yep, 100%. Certainly observe that in a lot of organisations. What do you think, Liam? What do you think is sort of the blockage there? Because is that around organisations that are hiring safety professionals, having the recognition that the function can add so much more value to their business than they even may realise?
Yeah, it's quite complex, and there's different blockers. So one is, I'd say, the weight of history, as Brian was touching upon, where health and safety has a particular I suppose viewpoint from the wider public, but actually if you look back 20 years, it is a lot better. I'd suggest people are probably less embarrassed to say they work in health and safety. And also people kind of don't want to get hurt at work or even out socially. So I think there has been progress, but I think the blockers in terms of actually career opportunities is just not seen as a viable route to, let's be honest, make some decent money, which that's why most of us go to work, and you're trying to find a route that you enjoy as well at the same time. That is an added benefit, and absolutely there's so many opportunities. And you have companies actually, again, marketed properly. Bigger companies actually really drove the agenda in their graduate schemes. I think we'll start to see some really good people come through to the market, but again, it depends on the organisation. What do they want out of the function? So it does need some trailblazers to kind of get to critical mass,
and then tell their story and demonstrate the pathway. And because there's that sort of the contrast, right, of two scenarios. Scenario one, perhaps more that traditional scenario of the health and safety professional was policing people in the organisation and telling them what they can and can't do, and sort of that sort of persona, and as a result of that, there's sort of a tension with their colleagues at work, and maybe it's not as valued as it could be, and sort of all that connotation. Then on the flip side, there's sort of I suppose a slightly more contemporary view of that, which is, I get to go to work and help my colleagues perform well in their job, go home safely each day. That creates huge value for my employer, which is valued by the business. And one of those is a really attractive sounding thing to want to contribute to and put your heart and soul into. Absolutely. And one isn't.
And there are huge amounts of success stories out there. Plenty of companies who are performing really well economically because their safety function works really well. So again, if we can talk really positively about those successes, that will help drive people into the organisations as well, into the sector.
Because there's a dual education and awareness piece here, right? There's business leaders and governance, board directors around recognition of the value proposition in safety, and using it as a lever to elevate business performance ultimately, as well as educating the safety profession itself around its own value so that it realises what it's worth. Brian, do you have a perspective?
Absolutely, 100% agree. I mean, I think I wouldn't underestimate the nature of the challenge. And I'm always one for a challenge and would consider myself, quote unquote, a disruptor in this sense, trying to push things along. But that weight of history is pretty significant. David Cameron, his association with Brexit, but he also is associated with saying a few things around health and safety probably 20 odd years ago, which really set the profession back around it being, I'm going to get rid of all this unnecessary regulation and all that sort of stuff. And so people made that association. But I think the other thing with it is people just feel safer if it's a compliance-based kind of linear, tell me what you want me to do and I'll sign the form, and we can all be sort of happy with that. So the kind of breakthrough is, well, no, we won't tell you what to do. We'll empower you to be curious and make decisions and risk assess, but that's kind of going against the grain in terms of the compliance stuff that we mentioned earlier. I mean, Sidney Dekker talks about compliance capitalism. We are in the thick of that in 2025 with the sort of weight of burden of compliance that organisations have to wade through.
100%. And you see it used politically, actually around the world, not just in the UK, around we're going to reduce red tape and reduce bureaucracy, and so there's a political narrative created that safety gets in the way of that of running a business. But then the flip side of that, and that's usually intended to attract kind of I suppose more business oriented voters, right? But then you go and talk to anyone who's started and run a really successful business, and you talk to them about safety, and they will tell you that safety is really a really constructive, important part of the mix of running a great business. So my own view on that is that there's this massive misfire in perception that a lot of politicians around the world think that business people think that safety is getting in the way of productivity and performance, but good businesses already recognise that it's really valuable and part of it. And so there's an awareness piece around that.
But in conjunction with that, you've got the problem, which is when something bad happens or there's a significant failure that has sort of societal level impact or is in the news. The tendency, particularly in Western democracies, is to just load more compliance, more regulation into the machine.
Yep.
And so you principally you might think that safety can add value, and yes, let's free it up and let's get it really humming. But the mechanics of here's 4 new pieces of legislation that I now have to comply with and be able to demonstrate that I'm complying with creates that sort of overload and complexity. So there's a will and a kind of a attitude or aptitude to want to do things differently. But the machine is so big and getting more cumbersome that's a very difficult trade-off to deal with.
Oh, it is. We're not going to solve that in an hour of.
But it's the disruptor.
Reflection.
That's somebody finding a way through that.
Yep.
That's going to be the kind of 21st century disruption, I think.
Yeah, and I was talking to a customer of ours from Safe 365, and they have operations in a number of countries, about 140 countries. And I was having a philosophical kind of conversation around this very dynamic around does more compliance, more regulatory rules result in lower harm, right? And his perspective, I won't sort of share who the company, but his perspective was that their highest harm rates were happening in a very developed, very regulated economy in the Southern Hemisphere, where there were probably more kind of compliance, regulation and rules than perhaps most other countries around the world. That was where they were experiencing their highest harm rates. And flip side, they're operating in some developing countries where there wasn't necessarily a regulatory driver, but that was purely around looking after workers because it's good for business, and their safety performance was significantly better. And so it's just this kind of, I'm sure there's all vast ranges of examples out there of different forms of that going on. And but I found that quite an interesting perception around, that default, let's regulate it because something went wrong, put some more rules in place, therefore something that'll stop that happening, but that doesn't necessarily land.
That's not just unique to safety. So in my line of work, in recruitment, consulting, if something isn't going right, we jump to change the process, and without actually thinking about the unintended consequences, jump to a conclusion before actually look at the necessary steps to get there. So safety, again, maybe should look outside of its normal realms to say, okay, what other disciplines have they had these challenges and maybe been successful or failed, and understand how they failed. So that cross-pollination of experience and speaking to other leaders outside the normal, I suppose, bubble may help find solutions.
Do you think, on that vein, in terms of some of those other disciplinary areas that have maybe got traction, if I think about the broader field of enterprise risk, for example, like it feels to me that discipline has got a lot more sort of strategic connection and uptake over the last, say, 20 years, where people don't think about enterprise risk and roll their eyes perhaps in the way that they might around health and safety. Is that a fair kind of observation? And is that because that sort of broader enterprise risk directly talks to the strategy and the strategic risks to an organisation, and therefore it's more accepted around the C-suite and the board table?
Yeah, I think that's precisely the reason why. Yeah. Firstly, it's probably there are enough high-profile instances of people going broke and probably directors going to jail and other things associated with some of these more strategic level catastrophic risk failures within organizations, whereas those health and safety sort of comparable failures, people tend to associate them with really high hazard industries and things that go catastrophically wrong, but they only happen once every 10 years, or that couldn't possibly happen to me because I'm in manufacturing, that's oil and gas, or that's nuclear, or that's, whereas I think some of those more sort of non-safety strategic risks have affected a range of different organizations, from banking through to retail through to a number of different other industries. So I would say that's correct, yeah. And
so that's around being able to then connect the value, right, the why into the organization at a strategic level. So to pick up one of your earlier points around reframing health and safety, because health and safety is kind of the what, right?
Yeah.
But resilience is probably the why.
Absolutely.
So do you want to talk us through that in terms of just that reorientation? Because I think that's a really important piece of positioning safety.
It is, and look, that's probably the thing that I'm right in the thick of at the moment in my organisation. I mean, first thing I'd say is to be in an organisation that's even willing to contemplate having that debate and that discussion at board level is quite exciting and motivating. But secondly, it allows, I think, somebody to have the ability to remain true to the moral conviction of people shouldn't be hurt.
Yep.
But you bolt on, I guess, an operations integrity lens to this to say, what is it about the things that we do that we have to ensure are resilient? Because if they're not resilient, and whilst it may not happen, or it's very unlikely that it would or could happen, if it did happen, what would that mean for the organisation?
Yep.
And people can see those types of failures and clearly see it would have, probably organisation kind of finishing potential, because it could be, significant amounts of money, it could be a significant loss of life, it could be reputationally, front page of the newspaper or on YouTube or on X or whatever. So people understanding that there's kind of two kinds of safety in an organisation like mine is helpful, because they can remain sort of anchored to that moral piece of nobody should be hurt. We agree. But what is it about the operations integrity and the way that we manage health and safety in our operations, which if it went wrong, it could have, kind of catastrophic level impacts for the company. So you kind of have to bring both along with you. And one is a resilience-based science, in my view, and the other is very much a human factors and a behavioural and a cultural-based thing that you continue to want to nudge along. But they're actually quite different, and the sort of failure mode is when people are too generic and blend them and think that if I'm good in one, then I must be good in another or in the other, etc., etc. So there's huge opportunity with this resilience piece and associating it with those major, highly unlikely things. But if they were to happen, my goodness, it wouldn't be great for the organisation.
Yeah, and we're certainly seeing that being talked about more and more, particularly in like critical infrastructure type organisations.
Absolutely.
That shift's happening in terms of that resilience focus. And if there's not already, I'm picking that at some point in the near future we'll start seeing Chief Resilience Officer roles popping up. And
it's a good idea. It's a good idea when we start to suggest some job titles to clients. Yeah, might chuck that one in the mix. But to pick it up on Brian's point about the financial side, there's a reason that data center markets are investing in their safety and safety resilience teams, is because if it goes wrong, it goes very wrong from a financial perspective. So you can see the shifts in those type of sectors, renewables as well, where people might not be getting hurt necessarily, but the financial risk those businesses and the end clients is absolutely huge.
Yeah, it's a business performance disruption rather than
absolutely.
The social impact on the person in terms of the harm and the cost of the insurance and things like that. They're factors, but actually the bigger risk. That's it. Is actually the business risk, right?
Yeah. And the way to manage them are actually quite different.
Yes.
That's the other piece. And I think unless the safety professional and the leader is able to fully understand that, you are operating slightly at a risk by believing that the way that I manage the human factors sort of personal safety bit is enough or sufficient such that I can bring that to bear on some of these, more complex, bigger, major hazards things. If people are operating like that, I think that's a risky place to be.
Yeah, and it starts to frame up kind of what we were talking about earlier in terms of the future of the role and some of the areas that are going to need to be sort of unearthed and developed over the coming years as we start to move towards 2030, 2040 and things change and evolve. And I'm sure there'll be other major disruptive events that will kind of reset people's thinking, which in some ways could prove to be like a bit of a leapfrog in terms of how quickly we can develop rather than just sort of iterating and evolving over time.
Yeah. I'd say one other thing on that in terms of the kind of primary emphasis of those two safeties. Traditionally on that sort of personal safety, injury management stuff, it's having lower levels of injuries or incidents is a demonstration of success.
Yes.
On the non-injury management, major hazards, big stuff, you actually want to know where your brittleness and weakness is.
Yes.
So the safety professional that is anchored to zero or keeping numbers down and therefore demonstrating I'm good
Yep.
is actually at odds with the science that's required to make sure that an organization is managing some of these more major things, because it's those weaknesses and brittleness and precursors that
Yep.
you precisely want to be telling people about so that you can act before they become
Yep.
major issues. So there's a real
Contrast.
contrast there for people to get their heads around.
Yep. And it's uncomfortable perhaps on the resilience side because it's not as tangible and as easy to see and really understand. But it's kind of like if something kind of wears down and enough factors start to interrelate with each other, and all of a sudden you have a black swan event, a major event, and inevitably someone says, well, did we see that coming? And invariably, generally can see it coming if you're looking in the right way, right? Which is what you're saying.
There's this drift towards failure, as people refer to it as, and you just want to be looking for the drift.
Yeah.
As opposed to I don't want to really say that because I'll look bad, or I'll get into trouble, or I'll disappoint operations if actually no, your job is to highlight when that drift is happening, and drift is a key indicator of brittleness.
And ultimately a shorter term slowdown in a productivity, whatever it may be, in order to ensure that resiliency is there. There's going to be a heck of a lot more strategic value to the company than landing on the event, because it wasn't.
Absolutely, yeah.
Just before we sort of start to wrap things up, I sort of want to really just a bit of a quick fire round, really, just get a bit of insight about each of you and sort of your own leadership pathway within the industry. Maybe start off with Liam. Like who is probably a key leader that inspired you in terms of that you looked up to, either that you knew as a mentor, or it might be someone out in the public domain that just really inspired you from a leadership development kind of perspective?
So obviously Shirley was a key influence.
Shout out to Shirley.
And so it's and see how she operates both from a technical perspective, also a human level.
Yep.
And that struck me as pretty early on, this is a place I wanted to be.
Yeah.
And there's other people in the organisation who have been really helpful in my career. And then I've been really fortunate to meet so many good safety professionals at all levels. And we've spoken a lot about the challenges in the sector, but actually going back to over the past 20 years, there's been huge developments positively. There's been great people to deal with, and there's so many opportunities. And there's not just Brian, but other safety leaders over the years where I've got little nuggets of information. I'm very fortunate to just ask good questions and get really interesting answers, which then I can then use in my day-to-day work.
Yep, nice, Liam. Brian, who's inspired you out there in your
career?
Yeah,
I mean, I similar to Liam, I think there's been a host of people. People right at the coalface, I should add.
Yep.
Maybe hierarchically, not at a leadership sense, the types of people that you would assume you would draw a lot of insight and learning from. But I've seen amazing supervisors and crew leaders down at a workface level that their bravery and courage and ability to sort of look after people is second to none. Some chief executives that I've had the pleasure to work with, a couple of whom are still here in the UK. Again, authenticity, courage, very good at articulating sort of an argument and able to convey that business imperative and safety imperative at the same time. But I also, even though I've sort of implied today that I'm a little bit less focused on some of the academic stuff that's emerging, I'm a big follower of many of the sort of academic and research people over the years. I think research is a core foundational element of any good safety leader. So if you are going to go and be passionate and want to convey something, it should be on the basis of some really good sound research and evidence-based insight, rather than just hunches or overly passionate kind of ways of conveying things.
Yeah, absolutely. What about if you're giving like a piece of advice to listeners out there? So we've got a cohort of both business leaders, but a lot of safety professionals, senior safety professionals. And if you're going to give them one piece of advice, Liam, that they could take out of this to focus on their development kind of pathway, what would it be?
Be curious. Just seek to understand what's going on around them. Speak to people in the organisation. As I say, at the coalface, at the top, other organisations. Just go out there and learn. Both socially, economically. Obviously see what's going on in the news. It sounds obvious, but you can be blinkered into your own little world, and actually there's a lot going on.
Keep
which
up.
affects you. Just keep asking questions.
Nice. Brian.
Yeah, I'd probably answer that in two ways. If I was talking directly to business leaders and people hiring, or even people at a board level, I would plead with them to think about safety, not just around why they have to do it, but what could safety truly give to the organization if it was done well. So intellectually engage with that and be curious around what it might give them. And then at the sort of other level, which is the person themselves, I think you've got to remain steadfast in your view that it is wrong and morally wrong that people should be hurt doing work, but you also have to have that empathy and ability to understand just the complexities and difficulties that operational teams face, trying to keep things safe and also trying to do all the other things that they're asked to do and probably KPI'd on and measured against. It's hard in the operational side, so be kind and be empathetic for the operational leaders as well.
Brilliant. Look, that's fantastic. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on this episode of the Art of Safety Leadership podcast. Thanks very much, Brian, Liam, your wisdom, your experience and your reflections on the market, where it's been, where it's going, and what people need to think about going forward has been invaluable. So thanks very much for your contribution today. It's been great having you.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
It's been great fun. Thanks.
Our pleasure. Thank you.